This is the beginning of part 3, and we're continuing with our story. And, you know, we're talking about things that of an opulence that we can't even imagine today. But that was the temple. And because of all the people who used to come and worship at the temple and bring their offering to the temple, this was very important, not even only in the religious life, but certainly in the economic life of the city of Jerusalem. And it was the reason why the chief priests and the high priests were enormously wealthy, okay? Enormously wealthy. Now, to serve this temple, there were a lot of priests. The estimates range between 10,000 and 20,000 priests. We don't know exactly, but every group would serve for 2 weeks out of the year. And an example of that is Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. So they would be called up for 1 week, and then they would come back later for another week. Everybody served, all 10 or 20,000 of them served during the 3 great pilgrim festivals when all the Jews would come to Jerusalem, or however many could come. Because sometimes they couldn't come because they were far away, or, you know, they were women, or they were too elderly, or whatever. But all of the priests would come at that time for an event like Passover. Now, the priests would get a portion of the sacrifices when they would come for their week of service. So they would get some of the first fruits. Remember, they're killing a lot of animals there. They're sacrificing a lot of animals. And then they would actually take the hides and they would tan the hides. And they were very valuable, by the way, because it's leather or fur. And that was given to the priests as part of their compensation. Now, what the chief priests had started doing long before the time of Christ, but is very well known, and this is documented in the Jewish sources, is that they started robbing the ordinary priests of the fruits of their labor during that week. They would literally send men with clubs when they were making a distribution. You're going home, okay, you're going to get this much grain, and you're going to get this many pelts, and you're going to get this much compensation for the week that you served at the temple. They would send people, thugs, with clubs, and they beat those ordinary priests, and they stole their compensation. They stole their tithes. And this is told to us by the Jewish leaders, the Jewish writings, because it was after this corruption that the temple got destroyed. So they start saying, well, why did God allow the temple to be destroyed? Well, maybe it's because the chief priests and the high priests were so corrupt. So you see, the ordinary priests only worked at the temple, you know, maybe total 3 or 4 weeks out of the year. The rest of the time, they had to support themselves. And they supported themselves as farmers or as fishermen or as, you know, or as shopkeepers or something like that. So but it was the cruelty and it was the avarice of the chief priests that really comes out when we read these stories about how they treated the ordinary priests who were not wealthy. Sometimes they were quite poor. Well, let's then talk about the chief priests. All the priests, in order to be a priest, you had to be descended from somebody in the tribe of Levi. You couldn't say like a boy today who says, I want to grow up and be a priest. That didn't happen. And by the way, you didn't choose your profession. Nobody said, I want to grow up to be. Nobody asked a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? You did whatever your father did. If you're a tent maker, you're a tent maker, like Paul. If you're a sandal maker, you learn to be a sandal maker. If you're a carpenter, like Jesus, your earthly father is Joseph, you learn to be a carpenter. That's how it worked. If you belong to the tribe of Levi, you grow up either to become a Levite or a priest. There were 2 branches of the tribe of Levi. If you're a Levite, you can never become a priest. You're just a Levite. The Levites were assistants. Levites were singers. That was the best job in the temple you could have, a singer, or you played instruments like trumpets. Levites were also the guards. They were the ones who made up the temple guards. They were the ones who guarded the door. They were the ones who kept order in the crowds. They were the ones who brought wood and other things that were needed. They could not enter the court of the priests, not one toe. So Levites did not measure up to the priests, but they could also like graduate. It's not like a deacon who could become a priest, nothing like that. If you're born into the priestly tribe and you're a young man of the tribe of Levi, you become a priest. when you grow up. When you turn 18, they would ask for your credentials. Believe it or not, you had to prove your lineage, that you were from the right lineage to become a priest, and you became a priest and you served as a priest. And you learned how to be a priest, but you served during your rotation. The chief priests, on the other hand, were taken from this small group of elite priests. Now, originally, the high priesthood descended from hereditary. Again, it's like being born into it, like a king or a queen. They were supposed to come from the family of Zadok, who was the high priest at the time of David. But hundreds of years before Christ, people started taking over the chief priesthood and the high priesthood by bribery. Again, we know this from Jewish writings. So the high priesthood was also totally corrupted. And they chose the men who would be the chief priests, and they chose their friends and their relatives. And most of the chief priests and the high priestly families intermarried within themselves so that they could keep the power and the money within the family. And at the time from the time of Christ, there were, in the first century, only a very small, like 2 or 3 families controlled the high priesthood. And the dominant one was the family of Ananias, or of Annas, from whom came Caiaphas. Annas had 5 sons, all of them became high priests, and Caiaphas was his son-in-law. He also became high priest. So they controlled it. So you should begin to appreciate the measure of power that these men had, because they chose the chief priests. And the chief priests ran the temple, and the temple was a massive organization, an institution, which involved a lot of money and personnel. And they got money back from this. They were the only ones who actually supported themselves through the temple. It was the chief priests, and they became extraordinarily wealthy because they also had to decide who's going to provide the wood, who's going to provide the silk, where are we going to get the water, the bread from, and all these other supplies that were needed by the temple. So of course they got a kickback from that. Okay, they benefited from that. And these people were extremely wealthy and privileged. All right, not to mention, as we mentioned, they were the ones who decide who can sell animals on the Temple Mount and who could be a money changer on the Temple Mount. And some of that money goes back to their pockets. So this is what the Lord objected to. So there were 3 main catalysts to the arrest of Jesus Christ, why he was arrested, why they decided to put him to death. 3 main things. The first thing was the raising of Lazarus. The second thing was the entry into Jerusalem. And the last thing was the cleansing of the temple. So I felt it was important for you to understand about the temple so that we could discuss it and you could understand why they were so alarmed by Jesus. But let's go back a moment and talk about the raising of Lazarus. Why is that such a pivotal event? Well, Jesus, as you know, had raised other people from the dead. We know about 2 of them. The raising of Jairus' daughter, the little girl who's 12 years old, and the raising of the son of the widow of Nain. But those people had just died. People were buried literally the day that they died. If they died late or at night, they were buried the next day. So people could say, and remember when Jesus raises the little girl from the dead, he says, don't cry, she's not dead, she's sleeping. People were laughing at him. He knew she was really dead. But it's easy to understand how some of them had said, hey, maybe she really didn't die. Maybe she was just sleeping after all. Or how he raises the son of the widow of Nain. The boy had just died that same day. So people could say, because it did say that people would be in a coma or something. They seemed dead, but they weren't really dead. Now, in the case of Lazarus, Lazarus is very well known in Bethany and also in Jerusalem, because Bethany is only 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, and Lazarus is very well known and very well respected. So when people heard that Lazarus had died, a lot of people came from Jerusalem to comfort the sisters and help prepare the body for burial. All right, now Jesus receives word that Lazarus is sick, but the day that they didn't know where he was. when they finally find him and give him word, come quick, Lord, because your friend Lazarus is sick. Jesus waits for 4 days. Now, we know that Lazarus had already died. It's a mistake to say he waited until Lazarus was dead. Lazarus had already died. And we know this because he says when he arrives there after 4 days, the sisters say he's been dead for 4 days. All right. And when he tells the disciples, I'm going to go wake up Lazarus. Lazarus is, I'm going to go wake him up. He must be getting better. They don't know that he's died. The disciples just think he's sick. And he waits there a couple more days, says, let's go see Lazarus. And they said, oh, he must be better. Jesus says, he's fallen asleep. Oh, he must be better. No, he has to tell them Lazarus is dead. How does he know that? He didn't get a second message that he died. He just knew. He's God. Of course he knew. So many people were witnesses to the death of Lazarus and his burial. They knew exactly when he died. Jesus arrives there 4 days after his death, and there are still people there who are comforting Mary and Martha, and they're friends of the family. They're still there. It's within a week. And so there was a very serious mourning period for that first week. The Jews still have it. So he says, show me where he's buried. He goes to the grave, right? And people come along to see what's going to happen. People think he's going to weep there. They don't know what's going to happen. But nobody expects Lazarus to be raised for another reason, because he's been dead for 4 days. And there was a Jewish tradition that the soul stayed near the body for 3 days, but on the 4th day, it's departed. So there's no way that life can come back into the body after the 4th day. And that's because the body has started to decay. And the fathers of the church actually believed that the body did decay and that it was smelling. Because remember, that's Martha's objection. Lord, it's been 4 days. There's going to be an odor. And so the fathers say that when the stone was moved away, people could smell the decay, the stink of death, right? So Jesus, of course, is totally unfazed by all of this. He raises Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus comes out, and there are people there who are watching this who had come from Jerusalem. What do? So, of course, everybody who really loves Lazarus goes home with the sisters to celebrate. It doesn't tell us that in the gospel, but obviously they took him home. They unwrapped him and took him home. Other people ran to Jerusalem to tell whom? The chief priest, the high priest at the great Sanhedrin, to tell what had happened, because there's no debating it anymore. Jesus raised someone from the dead, somebody who was deader than dead. He was already starting to decay, okay? So it's not like the daughter of Jairus, or I'm sure Jesus raised other people from the dead, but it's not like any of those risings. This is somebody who is definitely dead, deader than dead. He raised Lazarus from the dead, and there are lots of witnesses to this. Okay, so that's the first thing. After that, which is described in the Gospel of John in chapter 11, it tells us at the end of the chapter that there was an emergency meeting of the Sanhedrin. And people are saying, what are we going to do? This man does too many signs. What are we going to do about him? And they said, finally, the high priest says, you don't understand. He has to die. Because if we don't stop him, then the Romans are going to come and take away the holy place from us. Now, they didn't mean that they're going to destroy the temple. No. But that they would take away their power, because it is the chief priest, the high priest, that run the temple. And this is the place where they get their authority and their money and their power and their influence, because they cooperate with the Romans. So now remember, what they're saying is that the whole world is following after Jesus. They literally said that. He does too many signs. The whole world is following after him. The whole world is going to start following him. And so they're concerned that if Jesus starts a rebellion or a revolt, that the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, will be held responsible, and the Romans will take over or give their leadership role to somebody else. Now, we know that the great Sanhedrin has to cooperate with the Romans. They had to, because the Romans were the ones who allowed them to run the temple. And they worked very closely with the Romans. And one of the things that they had to do was make sure that there were no revolts, because the Romans didn't want any revolts. The Jewish leaders did not know that Jesus was not interested in worldly power. They didn't know that. I mean, let's be fair here. They didn't know that. So they thought that he and his followers were going to want to take over. And so they saw him as a threat to the temple. So the first thing that happens is the raising of Lazarus. Why is that also significant? Because it's because of the raising of Lazarus that Jesus receives this wonderful welcome into the city of Jerusalem. He's one of many pilgrims to the city of Jerusalem coming there for Passover. Why does he get this hero's welcome? Because of the raising of Lazarus. And only John explains that. The entrance into the temple, the entrance into Jerusalem is told in all four Gospels. And it is told to us that Jesus was hailed as the Messiah, as a great hero. The crowd is shouting, Hosanna, Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. By the way, all of those messianic titles, Son of David, Hosanna to the King of Israel, they say. The one who comes is a messianic title. The coming one, the Jews would refer to the one who is to come. So that's a messianic title. So they're shouting these messianic titles that have got this magnificent parade for him. He comes into the city, and the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, are watching this and saying, you see, the whole world is going after him. This man is dangerous. We have to put an end to this. We have to stop him right now before Passover. They don't know how they're going to do that. They've tried to arrest him before without success. The person that makes it easier is Judas, but we're not going to talk about Judas today. Judas makes the arrest of Jesus very easy and possible. All right, so it is the second catalyst is the entry into Jerusalem. The second reason, the second little event that causes this chain of events. So first we have the raising of Lazarus, and because of that, Jesus is welcomed as the Messiah into the city of Jerusalem. Now, our church is the only church, the Orthodox Church, that remembers the raising of Lazarus in the way that it's intended to be remembered as the trigger for the entry into Jerusalem. We celebrate it the day before Palm Sunday. Nobody else does that, just the Orthodox do. Because the church is showing us and teaching us historically, why did people come and meet Jesus? He's not just some random prophet or something like that. He's a person who raised Lazarus from the dead. So when people heard he was coming, they escorted him into the city and they shouted, and it's considered a magnificent feast of the church. Have you ever wondered why? Because Jesus is going to his death, right? He's on his way. It's the last week of he's going to be dead within 5 days. We know that. Why does the church celebrate it? Why is it a beautiful day? Why is it a joyful day if we know he's going to his death? Because I'll tell you that the Catholic Church calls that day not only Palm Sunday, and they celebrate it. The people meet the priest outside. They process into the church and they're waving palms. It's a Palm Sunday for them, but they also call it Passion Sunday. And the gospel reading is about the crucifixion of the Lord in the Catholic Church. They get it that he's going his way to his passion. It's not that we don't know that. But why is that a joyful day in the Orthodox tradition? Because it is the one and only time that the Lord recognized and acknowledged that he is the Messiah. Other times, people would say, you're the Messiah, like demons. You're the Son of God, or Peter, yes, but don't tell anyone. But he receives the acclamation of the crowd. And that's one thing that's held against him by the Jewish leaders, you see? And they use that against him later in the trial against Pilate. He allows the crowd to call him Messiah, King of Israel, and that is treason. Now, the last catalyst for the led to the arrest and crucifixion of Christ is the cleansing of the temple. When he enters Jerusalem, he cleanses the temple. And as I said, this is mentioned In all four Gospels, just like the entry into Jerusalem, the cleansing of the temple is mentioned in all four Gospels, which tells us how important that event is. Now, you might be aware that in the Gospel of John, the cleansing of the temple is done early in the ministry of Christ. In the Synoptics, it's done on the last week of Christ's ministry when he's come there for Passover. And there's a lot of discussion among Bible scholars about why this is the case. Some of the fathers of the church, like Chrysostom, thought that he cleansed the temple twice. I think that's unlikely, with all due respect to St. John Chrysostom. It's very difficult to know, but the fathers typically try to harmonize these things. I don't think it matters. I don't think the Bible is dishonest. I think what happened is he may have cleansed the temple early on, but because the Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have only one trip to Jerusalem, they place the cleansing of the temple in that last week. Because we know that Jesus went to Jerusalem many, many times, but those other trips are not described by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They just talk about his Galilean ministry, whereas John has Jesus in Judea, on the other side of the Jordan. He comes back, he goes to Samaria, he goes to Galilee, comes down. He's all over the place in John's gospel. So John is keeping that chronology. But because of its importance, that's why Matthew, Mark, and Luke put it at that one trip to Jerusalem, that the only one that they describe. Again, that's not that they're dishonest. And maybe Chrysostom is right. Maybe he cleanses it twice. I think it's unlikely because he made his point the first time. But be that as it may, this event is extremely important because it's linked to the crucifixion, to the arrest and the crucifixion, because this event comes out at his trial before the Jewish leaders. It's not important in the trial before Pilate, which is the Roman trial. It's important in the trial before the Jewish leaders. They're going to mention this. This becomes very important. That's why it's in all four Gospels. So let's talk about the cleansing of the temple. Another mistake that people often make, or maybe it's just that I'm not thinking about it, people will sometimes say, if they get angry, well, Jesus got angry too, as if this act was an act in which Jesus lost his temper. No, he didn't lose his temper. All right. Was he angry? Yes. If he was angry, it was a righteous anger. But he didn't lose his temper. That's what we do. That's a passion. When you lose your temper, it's a passion. But that's not, we know that the Lord was passionless. The Lord did not commit sin. So the anger was something that was directed at something that was unjust. It was a righteous kind of anger, but he didn't just see things, because remember, he went there for his whole life, saw the money changers, saw the animals being sold, participated in that with his family. It's not like all of a sudden there's money changers there and he loses his temper and decides to trash the place. That's not what happened. He was making a statement. He knew that that action, the cleansing of the temple, would directly lead to his death, because it would be seen as a challenge to the authority of the chief priests and high priests who ran the temple. That's their baby. Who is this guy coming here to tell us what to do? And by the way, if they lost control of the temple, they lost everything. They lost their money, their wealth, and their power. And to them, that's everything. And Jesus had a lot of people behind him. If he wanted to start a revolt, he could have done that. So why does he cleanse the temple? Because he was objecting to the tremendous corruption at the temple, that the temple was being run by these families, not because of their great piety, not because they loved the Lord, but because they wanted to line their pockets. So he was making a statement that this is inappropriate. It's wrong. This is a real blasphemy, how you're using the temple for your own financial gain, for your own power. But there's something else. It is also a sign that sacrifice of the temple, the animal sacrifice at the temple, is going to come to an end. Why is that? Because the temple for the Jewish people was the place where God dwelt. God was with his people in the temple. Now, they weren't stupid. They knew God wasn't confined to a box. But God was really believed to be present with his people in the presence of the temple. God was there at the temple in a real sense. But when they talk about the kavod of God, the glory of God filled the temple, this is a reference to the presence of God. There was a strong sense that God was present with his people right there in Jerusalem at the temple. But guess what? God is now present on earth in flesh and blood in the person of Jesus Christ. And through Christ, animal sacrifice is going to come to an end because of Christ. Because from now on, people will no longer worship God with the blood of animals, but in spirit and in truth. And so that's also part of the meaning of the cleansing of the temple. Now, when he cleansed the temple, the chief priests confront him. By what authority do you do these things? And now, give us a sign. Now they're demanding a miracle, which, by the way, Jesus never did a miracle when somebody demanded it, even to save his own life, like Herod Antipas wanted a miracle before the crucifixion. They wanted him to prove that he had authority. I don't think they would have been convinced even by a miracle. But when they say, by what authority do you do this? And Jesus says to them in the Gospel of John, in the Synoptics, he says, you've made my Father's house a den of thieves. Okay, yeah, because they literally stole, not only from the people, also from the priests, the ordinary priests, stealing what was due to them. But in John's Gospel, he says this, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, he's talking about the temple of his body. They did not understand that. They thought he's talking about the physical temple, which has these massive stones, which I told you. They look at this and say, come on, you can't raise this temple in 3 days. Another reason why they were concerned about him is this. There were messianic prophecies. There were prophecies that the Messiah would build a new temple. And so you see, all of these things make them afraid that Jesus is out because he's allowed the people to proclaim him as the Messiah. He's out to seize political power, and that will be their ruin. That will cause the destruction of the nation, certainly the loss of their own private power. So Jesus is not planning to physically destroy the temple, but that is the charge that will be brought against them at his trial, brought against him by them at his trial, that he threatened to destroy the temple. But the Jewish leaders, what they want is to secure, to protect their own income power, their own prestige. And these are the three catalysts that led to the arrest of Jesus. They saw him as a real threat. There was a tremendous potential at Passover time for a riot, because during Passover, the Jewish people were anticipating or remembering their liberation from slavery under the Egyptians. And they had in their midst this amazing prophet, that's what they thought he was, who literally raised someone from the dead. And so they really believed that the Jewish leaders and the Romans were also aware of Passover being a time of great religious and nationalistic fervor. That's why Pilate was there with extra troops. But this is why the Jewish leaders are concerned, because if there's going to be a revolt, it's going to be a time when there's a lot of people in the city. And crowds also have a way of causing that to happen. So they were very concerned. And so they resolved that they would put him to death before Passover. They didn't know how that was going to happen, but they knew that it was going to happen. And they got a lucky break because somebody came. The reason why they didn't know how they were going to do it, because they had attempted to arrest Jesus before many times. And he either slipped away from them in the crowd, or on one occasion, the temple guards went to arrest him and they came back without him. And the chief priest said, why didn't you arrest him? And he said, no one has ever spoken like this man. They couldn't bring themselves to arrest him. This was the grace that flowed from him. This was the power and the eloquence of his words. So they were never able to arrest him. And they were also afraid to arrest him sometimes because of the crowds. because the crowds loved Jesus and supported him. And the person who gave them their lucky break was Judas, because Judas came to them offering to tell them where Jesus could be arrested in the middle of the night when there were no crowds around. But we'll have to leave that until next time. This is the end of part 3. We've concluded our little series. If you want to know more about this, you can look for my book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory by Dr. Eugenia Constantinou. And please support OCN. And thank you for joining us for this series.